So thanks so much for having me and organizing this fantastic conference. My name is Cara Chellew, and I'm coming here today from Montreal, so it's morning, but good afternoon to everyone. So I'm a PhD candidate in urban planning, policy, and design at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and my dissertation research focuses on the planning, design, and governance of public space. But today I'm going to present some ongoing work on the concept of ordinary nights, as well as an overview of some night policies that were recently developed in Canada's two largest cities, Toronto and Montreal. While the planning, design, and governance of the city at night mostly focuses on the nighttime economy and its regulation, I'm interested in the ordinary or routine needs of people who work or use the city after dark on a regular basis. And since both Toronto and Montreal developed night policies in recent years, this research explores to what extent do these policies address the ordinary needs and desires of people who live, work, and inhabit the city at night. So this research I'm presenting today is inspired in part by some previous work I did with a project called Nighttime Design within Four Marginalized Communities based at McGill. And I also approached this work with over 20 years experience working at night, both within and outside of the traditional nighttime economy, and also as a musician who spent a lot of time playing music and going to shows both in Toronto and Montreal. So to start, the night is both a natural feature of our planetary existence and socially produced and mediated through our daily practices, rhythms, and routines. It can be understood as not just a time, but also a space that has its own inhabitants and practices. And night is an important time for rest, repair, and maintenance, not only for infrastructure, but also for the human body and for broader social life. And while often the night is associated with fear, crime, and immorality, it can also be a time space of sociability and conviviality. And so, and this is in part because the easing of flows and the pressures of the daytime city can create a more permissive and relaxed kind of social atmosphere. The night has also been long known as a space of refuge, especially for marginalized communities who find safety in being less visible. Increasingly, the night is also viewed as a space or frontier to expand the daytime economy. As both post-industrial cities work to attract the creative class and compete with other cities for global investment, the nighttime economy is presented as a space for expanding economic opportunities. And since the early 2000s, cities in Europe and North America have been taking steps to formalize nighttime governance by developing policies to manage and promote the nighttime economy. So the planning, design, and governance of the city at night primarily focuses on the nighttime economy and its relationship to consumer capitalism. There is less focus on the everyday or every night needs of people who work or use the city after dark. Ordinary nightlife is made up of a variety of formal and informal activities, such as eating, shopping, strolling, people watching, playing, loitering, resting, and socializing. These routine interactions enrich the lives of urban residents by fostering a sense of community and attachment to place. Su Jan Yao and Chi Kang Hang write, in stark contrast to this postmodern spectacle of contemporary nightlife are the mundane nighttime activities that pervade the everyday spaces of ordinary people. A shift in focus from spectacular to ordinary nights is connected to the concept of everyday urbanism. And this is the idea that ordinary human experience is meaningful and should be a focus of urban research, and it was first popularized by Henri Lefebvre. According to Lefebvre, everyday life forms the basis of social experience as well as urban politics. The everyday can be described as mundane and ordinary routines made up of repeated activities like commuting, working, shopping, and relaxing. And similarly, ordinary nights are produced through these repeated activities and routines. And it is through the exploration of these ordinary nights and the experience of its inhabitants that we can seek to understand the richness and complexity of the urban night. While the city at night is both spectacular and ordinary, spectacular night spaces are often produced through state-led processes of urban regeneration and placemaking that promote spaces of mass leisure, as well as street vitality, which is a really crucial element. Neoliberal revitalization strategies not only transform cities into 24/7 sites of production and consumption, but also produce standardized experience of nightlife centered on alcohol consumption and Western cultural practices. The homogenization of nightlife discourages participation from older people, from people who don't drink alcohol, and it can also limit the exposure to diverse, experimental, and transgressive subcultures that are increasingly pushed to the periphery or underground due to urban redevelopment processes and the high costs of rent. The ideals of urban citizenship and the right to the city must also include the right to occupy the night. The fight for inclusion in city life and urban space is also what Henri Lefebvre calls the right to the city. Lefebvre originally envisioned this right to urban life as emerging from the everyday lives of working class and poor people through the appropriation of urban spaces and their refusal to be excluded. It's a collective right to change and reinvent the city and to have some sort of shaping process over the processes of capitalist urbanization. Under capitalism, it is the ordinary nights rather than the spectacular that are the sites for resistance and transformation. And activities associated with ordinary nights, such as those that are free or creatively driven, can challenge the dominance of commercialized nightlife and night spaces. So this brings me back to my research question. Given the planning, design, and governance of the urban night primarily focuses on the nighttime economy, to what extent do night policies developed in Toronto and Montreal address the ordinary needs and desires of people who live, work, and exist in the city at night? And so my methods for this work is I'm doing a qualitative document analysis of night policy and public consultation documents, as well as a review of relevant news articles. And as I'm doing my review, I'm looking for information that follows. When was the policy developed or passed? What are the definitions that are provided for nightlife and the nighttime economy? What is the goal of the policy and what are the objectives? Why was the policy developed and what was it meant to address? Who are the actors and stakeholders that were involved? What was the consultation process and what was heard versus what was implemented? And so Toronto's night policy, Toronto's nightlife action plan was completed in 2019 and was inspired by nighttime governance models developed in cities like Amsterdam, Berlin, and New York City. The goal of the policy is to, quote, coordinate municipal services, planning, and policies to strengthen 24-hour creative activity with a particular focus on developing emerging entertainment areas outside of the downtown core. Informed by consultations with residents, artists, businesses, professional organizations, and various city divisions, the plan has three main objectives. The first is to plan the night, and this involves support for live music and entertainment, as well as social culture at night, and it includes designating a member of city council as a night ambassador, which they did. The second is protect the night, which involves promoting the safety of nighttime visitors and workers, as well as protection for music venues under the agent of change principle. And the third is create the night, which identifies opportunities to expand nightlife outside of the downtown core by identifying areas that can support entertainment uses and also by reviewing zoning and licensing bylaws. So now to Montreal. After years of advocacy work by grassroots groups like MTL, Big Cat, Montreal's night policy, Vive Montréal la nuit, which means Experience Montreal at Night, was completed in 2024. Work on the policy began in 2020 and included consultations with a variety of stakeholders in the entertainment and cultural sector, as well as residents, a lot of consultations with residents, tourists, businesses, institutions that serve the public, and organizations that work with vulnerable and marginalized people. The goal of Montreal's night policy is to, quote, promote the harmonious coexistence of nighttime economic and cultural activities while addressing the needs and aspirations of Montreal residents. And Montreal's night policy has four main objectives. The first is to consolidate Montreal nights by designating areas as nightlife hubs, updating noise bylaws, and coordinating city services. The second objective is to offer safe and inclusive Montreal nightlife, such as implementing measures to promote responsible and inclusive party practices, support for organizations with experience mitigating health and safety issues, and ensuring nighttime activities coexist with vulnerable populations in public spaces. The third objective is to expand and develop Montreal's nightlife, and this can be done by relaxing regulations that govern opening hours, granting permits to extend legal alcohol sales, and facilitating the use of space that are far from residential areas. And the fourth objective is to establish an appropriate and agile governance model. And this is done by involving boroughs and municipal services, setting up a nightlife roundtable, and encouraging research sharing in the implementation of best practices. So I'm going to conclude today with a few preliminary findings from my review. The first is the need to protect night spaces. So both Toronto and Montreal's night policies were developed in the context of the loss of small and mid-sized music venues, which are an essential part of the ordinary nightlife for many artists, residents, and visitors. The high cost of commercial rents and urban development has been linked to dozens of venue closures over the last decade in both Toronto and Montreal. And this was happening before the pandemic. The pandemic, accelerated some of the closures, but this was a trend that has been happening through the 2010s. And so while the City of Toronto passed the Agent of Change principle in 2018 to protect cities' music venues against encroaching residential development and inevitable noise complaints, Montreal has no such policy in place. And so for folks that aren't familiar with the Agent of Change principle, it entails that individuals or businesses that make a change in a community, like creating a new urban development, must manage the impact of the change on the community, on existing businesses, and on neighbors. So if a developer builds next to an existing music venue, they're responsible for disclosing to residents that they're moving next to a venue and for arranging for adequate soundproofing. So while Montreal's night policy does include some support for helping smaller venues to do soundproofing, noise complaints and the very hefty fines that come with them are still leading to venue closures. And the most recent one was closed this past July. So there's a need to be addressing and figuring out how to better protect these smaller night spaces. And my second finding is the need for more supportive infrastructure. So consultation documents for both Toronto and Montreal's night policies emphasize people's desire for expanded public transit options. Yet both policies include transit as almost an afterthought. In Montreal, consultation documents state, improving public transportation services is almost unanimously supported among the interventions, both to ensure the safety of night owls and to ensure the successful deployment of nighttime vitality zones, end quote. Yet its inclusion in the policy states that the creation of nightlife hubs may eventually require an improvement in transportation services, rather than acknowledging this strong desire and support for late night transit options. And similarly, in Toronto, the public consultation summary states, quote, there were repeated calls across all stakeholder groups for an increase in transit service, especially as it relates to the evening rush hour and late night service. Many people suggested that the city introduce 24-hour transit beginning with Friday and Saturday nights, similar to London's night tube in the United Kingdom, end quote. So yet again, in Toronto's night policy, the action for transit is to, quote, explore opportunities for additional transportation options specific to the nighttime economy and report back in 2020. 2020 was a year where the pandemic hit. I don't think there was any report back at that time. And, with the pandemic, public transportation services really suffered too. So to my knowledge, there hasn't been any kind of real look back at expanding transit options in Toronto. So to wrap up, the city at night is both spectacular and ordinary, yet there's a lack of attention that's paid to the planning, design, and governance of ordinary nightlife. Through a review of recently developed night policies in Toronto, Montreal, preliminary findings reveal that there's a strong need to support night spaces and protect them, and to provide more supportive infrastructure to support ordinary nightlife. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gonzalo de Blas, and I'm really honored and a bit nervous to be here today. This is my very first international conference, and I'm learning too much attending to these presentations and sharing this incredible space with some investigators who are an inspiration for me. Some of them have served as a guiding light in my own research, indeed. So, thank you. And this talk is meant to summarize a little bit of my investigation during the internship of the Master of Social Intervention in the Autonomous University in Madrid, tutorized by the well-known here investigator Begoña Mayona. So please take this as a humble voice of a beginner still learning how to speak academically, and sorry for my English. The title of my talk is Chueca by Night When the Lights Go Out, because during the time I was there, I was able to observe that the neighborhood not only transformed enormously during the night, it was also at that time of the day that it took on qualities that in other parts of the center city center seemed to be lost. So the night, as one local told me in an interview, consecrated Chueca as an oasis for those who had to escape the patriarchal corrective violence. There is no interview or conversation in which it's not glimpsed or directly assumed that under the moonlight, Chueca and its people reappear in other costumes and forms. So, why Chueca? So, Chueca is a small neighborhood in central Madrid, as you know, but it has played a huge role in Spain's LGBTQIA plus history since the 1980s, more or less. It became the symbolic and material heart of sexual dissidents, a safe haven where queer people could meet, desire, and organize politically after decades of the Franco's dictatorship. But like many urban enclaves of that type, Chueca has changed dramatically. It evolved from a refugee into a state, a global and stereotypical brand of tolerance and homosexuality, homonormativity. And the main question guiding my research were: is it politically positive? It's 2025. Is it a stage of liberation, or has it been a sort of a theme park? So Ignacio Elpidio, for example, as other authors, defends and believes that Chueca may disappear, but I think that why should we lose the loudspeaker that it continues to be? Why not reappropriate the neighborhood and take advantage of its centrality? For some, it is a ghetto, but Mili, who is the owner of the first elite club in the neighborhood and in Madrid and in Spain, told me in an interview they call to ghetto. They tell us that we should integrate into the rest of the society, but aren't human beings gregarious? Doesn't it happen in other parts of the city without anyone complaining? So now I'm going to explain a little bit of the methodology. These are some pictures of my nights in Chueca. To explore these questions, I conducted a situated ethnography. Over several months, I carried out 15 semi-structured interviews with key actors in the neighborhood, residents, workers, activists, drag queens, and clients, and I combined them with 40 field outings, half of them during the day and half of them during the night. During my daytime walks, I took notes, listened, and observed how the neighborhood functioned as part of the ordinary city, the cafes, shops, schools, and the daily routines of its inhabitants. And at night, I recorded short audio reflections after visiting the clubs, inside the clubs as well, the bars and the squares. I watched how people interacted, how they flirted or made friends once the sun went down. It was curious the difference between a beer place and a twink place, as is known. For example, the codes there were different because in the beer place, the code was more masculine and they had no problem to get close if they want to meet someone. But on the other hand, in twins places. The game of glances um, in these bars could last all night without apparent resolution. So it's very different. And I also participate in two guided walks, one with a neighbor and another one with a tourist group in a free tour to capture both like local memories and external narratives of Chueca. And my analytical process followed Brown and Clark's thematic analysis combined with grounded theory for the narrative reconstruction of practice participants' experience. It was, yes, a little bit a mix of this thematic analysis and grounded theory. So, sorry. The theoretical frame, I named it Geographies of Desire. The central concept guiding my research was called First Geographies of Pleasure. Was a name proposed by Begoña, but then I changed it to Geographies of Desire, and I'm going to try to explain a little bit what it was about. This idea works as an umbrella to think of places like Chueca and another LGTB communities, not just as physical spaces, but as symbolic territories built for pleasure, encounter, recognition. What defines for me a geography of desire is not the architecture, the streets, or the buildings, but its function, the way it channels desire as a social force. Following an Aristotelian logic, desire is like a potential, and pleasure is its actualization. So Chueca can be seen as a framework where desire, as energy, curiosity, aspiration, can become real through shared experience. So in this sense, the geographies of desire such as Chueca are not immovable scenarios, but frameworks of actualization and action. Places where the power of desire represents, as I argue, better material, social, and symbolic conditions to become an act. For example, Chueca's discotheques are meeting places for people of very different generations and ages, nationalities, and something is something for me quite exceptional in other parts of the city of Madrid. And historically, the night has been the moment where this potential was most free to emerge. So under darkness, norms dissolve, and the night shelters desire and makes room to the things that the day represses. But today, those spaces of possibility are increasingly shaped by market logics, tourist consumption, and homonormativity, as I said before. One participant described this as a kind of Disney World of diversity. And in general, we know that LGBT enclaves have been established at first thanks to initial marginalization and a subsequent abandonment by the owners to the detriment of other places considered safer and more social prestigious. And once these displacements took place, there was a sudden availability. The prices went down, and LGBT people began to move. In Chueca, this happened around 1980s, and residents from other neighborhoods or cities, victims of exile, bought a home here or set up their own businesses, as Boivin, an author, narrated. And this first moment of self-governance is nowadays co-opted by the cultural mercantile dynamics of the new LGTB neighborhoods, which end up to be gentrified, a term from O'Sullivan's work. That is the expulsion of these first inhabitants of the 80s, 90s, it depends on the city, and the representativeness in general, replaced by tourism, big business, and multi-property owners. So a lesbian neighbor, I remember, that said to me with great pain in an interview, "I don't want to leave. I don't have financial problems, but I have to leave, and I live crying because in my building it's no longer possible to live. It used to be a neighborhood of neighbors, and now there are none. The last ones that are left are going to die. It's all vacation rentals, and it's terrible. Noise, dirt. Before people knew each other, and I stopped to talk to you or had, for example, a shop for good value clothes or food, but now." So that was quite sad. And what I saw during my time in Chueca is a little bit like a hope for me. Uh, During the time of the investigation, before and after, I could see the identification with the territory of the neighbors and also some tourists and regulars of Chueca. And I think that can be a channel of empowerment. So, another thing interesting to me is that nowadays there's a big reaction to identity politics, also known as wokeism, and if often emerge in the political debate, even on the left, as something bad. But I think Chueca is a representation that with these urban tribes and this palimpsest of social identities, that is an example, sorry, of how personal identification with these geographies of desire led people to mobilize and not the rights in abstract. I think if we look up for the story, for the history of these places, we can see this. So desire and place attachment as a power overflow any attempt of total capitalization and open up opportunities for resistance. I think we have to take advantage of centrality, the accessibility, resources, networks already built of Chueca and other places, LGTB neighborhoods around the world. And I think these possible community interventions to recover these places back to residents is necessary to be done, taking into account the things that are working overall at night for me. So next, sorry. Some findings of this thematic analysis I told before are about inclusion and exclusion. Chueca was once built through exclusion, as I explained. People came because they were not accepted elsewhere. Now, paradoxically, exclusion has reappeared inside the neighborhood itself, especially along lines of gender, class, and race. For example, another thing a participant told me, a drag performer, was that it's supposed to be everyone's space, but not everyone can afford to belong. Other thing I I could see in the thematic analysis is the geography of borders that is here in the presentation. I think you can see. Yes, I created those maps for the day and the night. So spatially, Chueca sits between Gran Via and the wealthy areas of Recoletos, and walking toward or away from its center, you can literally feel a shift in class, aesthetics, and urban practices. For example, many residents of the Recoletos neighborhood are out during working hours. So these boundings change a lot during the day towards the night, and they are like a symbolic thresholds between visibility and invisibility, and diversity is still infinitely greater at night, I think. And during the day, Chueca's functions um, are the same like functions of another neighborhood of the center, another touristified neighborhood, sorry, like brands, cafes, boutiques, short-term rentals, tourists taking photos to the rainbow flags, and at night these changes and the same streets sorry transform. Um, Although there are also tourists, it is more difficult to distinguish them from the rest of the Madrileñans or the people that live there. Clubs like the Lirio or Black and White become temporary commons, spaces where individual identities blur and communities reappear. So, as conclusions, I want to underline that my research suggests that Chueca remains a territory of few opportunities, a symbolic and material space that still holds the potential to produce more inclusive futures, and the challenge is to empower local communities and pressure the institutions to protect these neighborhoods from speculation and commercialization and commodity. Sorry. For example, by prohibiting new license for hotels or Airbnbs, like doing in Barcelona, by reclaiming the old spaces for socializing during the day. A boy of my age in an interview told me how the main square had been taken away from the children by terraces, for example, and in Chueca there is not a single park. So the attachment to place can be a powerful tool for political action and to imagine another Chuecas. And I have like questions, but I don't know if I have time to the public. Mm.
We still have time.
Yes. Okay. So there are still many questions I haven't been able to answer, and I like to leave them to open a discussion here if you want. Sorry. So I don't know. Should we protect the heritage of emblematic night venues as part of our urban memory? And how can we empower local residents and foster real community participation in day life governance inspired by the night governance? And is there a way to imagine forms of tourism that do not lead to dispossession? So that's the end. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me today. My name is Katelyn and I'm a sociology PhD student and assistant lecturer at the University of Kent. Today I'm going to be presenting some emerging findings from my PhD research entitled Sexual Geographies in the Gentrified City, an exploration of the regeneration of historical red light districts in London's King's Cross. When completing my master's degree at LSE in the heart of London, I became very interested in hearing stories from the local community about different urban changes that have taken place over time. King's Cross consistently came up as an area of interest, and I decided to investigate further. So one of the first things I noticed was that most research on King's Cross's regeneration spanned between the years of 1997 to 2010, with no recent takes on the development since. Additionally, I found that the research which had been done was mostly static in nature, which has inspired me to study the area's regeneration while on the move, using a combination of ethnographic observation, qualitative interviews, and also mobile methods. Finally, the area's seedy past has allowed for me to focus on regenerative changes over time relating specifically to the nighttime economy, including sex work, the licensing of sexualized venues, and other associated issues. In fact, King's Cross was historically considered a red light district, but is now frequently referred to as a new cultural quarter for London. A vast machinery of policing measures and policy reform have led to this change, removing undesirable nighttime populations from the streets. The result? King's Cross is largely considered London's most successful regeneration project. The map to the left shows the boundaries of the King's Cross ward, which is part of the London Borough of Camden. To the right, you can see a map displaying my area of study, which melds together the King's Cross ward and a part of Somers Town, a neighboring community which has also been impacted by changes to the area. Within this area of study, I've identified 4 main locales where red light venues and activities were concentrated. All of these areas are within close proximity to one of 3 train stations, which are historically notorious for being infiltrated with informal and/or nighttime activities due to the element of anonymity associated with train stations, such as people frequently passing in and out. So to the left, in the vicinity of Euston Station, is an area that was full of sex shops, strip clubs, and brothels. Up top, behind St. Pancras and King's Cross stations, is where nightclubs such as Bagley's and raves were common. To the right of King's Cross is an area where several adult cinemas were located and a few streets where sex workers also solicited. And finally, below King's Cross is an area known as Argyle Square, which is surrounded by hotels. This was the primary site for sex workers to congregate and the area that was probably the most heavily policed during the early years of the regeneration. This brings me to my methods. So my work takes a multi-method approach by bringing together data from ethnographic observations, semi-structured stakeholder interviews, mobile interviews with King's Cross residents, archival research, and a review of grey literature. Let's start with ethnographic observations. So the intent behind this close involvement or immersion is to generate data through watching and listening to what people naturally do and say, but also to add to the dimension of personally experiencing and sharing the same everyday life as those I'm trying to study. So far, I've undertaken around 50 hours of this in 3 key areas, which are King's Cross Square, Granary Square, and also outside of Euston Station. I've also conducted 10 semi-structured interviews with stakeholders either involved in or impacted by King's Cross's regeneration in order to shed light on the perceived impact of the regeneration project. My stakeholder interviews are then complemented by mobile interviews with inhabitants of King's Cross. I've completed 4 of these so far, their aim being to shed light on the actual impact that the regeneration has had on people who regularly use this space. Because theorists like Doreen Massey and David Harvey advocate that space is fluid rather than stand still in nature, these walking interviews challenge previously static narratives surrounding King's Cross. Finally, my project combines my qualitative findings with archival research and grade literature relating to the area's regeneration, policy, and planning in order to answer the central research question. To what extent has urban regeneration contributed to the sanitization of sexual spaces in King's Cross? Thematic analysis of my interviews with stakeholders in King's Cross unveiled several pertinent themes relating to the area's regeneration, including but not limited to antisocial behavior, sex work specifically, liminality, deprivation, exclusion, gentrification, community, space, place, transience, redevelopment, and the so-called success. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be focusing on 2 of these in the coming slides, which will be liminality and success. Before we look at those in more detail, preliminary analysis of my mobile interviews has led to the identification of the following themes, which are also of interest. So similar to the stakeholder themes, we have antisocial behavior, sex work specifically, space, place, and then a couple new ones, which are character and regeneration. In addition, to the left of the slide, you can see 2 of the 4 routes I've taken with my mobile interview participants so far, which they've actually drawn up themselves. Letting my participants draw up their own routes to take me on allows them to have power over the direction of the interview and treats them as the knowledgeable subjects rather than me, the researcher. First, let's look at the so-called liminality of King's Cross in the past. Generally speaking, liminal can be defined as on a threshold. So not only is King's Cross on the geographical threshold of central London as a whole, the activities and venues there have also historically operated on the boundaries of moral acceptability. This includes antisocial behavior like drug taking and curb crawling. This is reinforced by both stakeholder and resident accounts of the old King's Cross being seedy. However, what's interesting is that stakeholders were also quick to point out that King's Cross was a previously derelict or empty area with no residents, although census data, which we'll look at in a moment, illustrates that this was not entirely accurate. In fact, not only did people choose to live in King's Cross prior to its regeneration, people also stayed living there, particularly younger people. What makes King's Cross a truly liminal space was its transformative potential. Its ability to turn into a nice place as opposed to a vice space. As John, a long-term resident of King's Cross, indicates, the area was ripe for redevelopment. All of that said, the enormous transformation that has taken place over the past 25 years is what makes King's Cross a success story to many of the people involved in this research. As Peter Bishop said, King's Cross has become a totally new part of London. It is cited internationally as one of the seminal developments in the last 20 years globally, and I think it is the best development we did in this country of its type. It's a popular destination. People go there. However, this statement has implications about whose London it was before regenerative efforts took place. Contrary to stakeholder accounts claiming that the area was empty, King's Cross actually had nearly 16,000 inhabitants in 1991, 1/3 of whom belonged to ethnic minority groups. King's Cross was also considered an area of deep deprivation, with most inhabitants belonging to the working class. In turn, one might question how successful King's Cross's regeneration has been, based on the fact it was not drawn up with the working class in mind. As Bethany Colin states, I guess there's a slight question mark in how successful. I think a lot of it is quite successful, but I think maybe if you went and spoke to residents in surrounding communities, there's a slight disconnect between here and there and whether or not they feel this is a place for them. This raises the question, is the new King's Cross a place for everyone? As one of my mobile interview participants argues, lower income individuals likely feel out of place and can't afford to spend time there, even though benefits like increased safety are definitely undeniable. Bethany herself even admitted that people from Somerstown, which is next door to King's Cross, may feel disillusioned from King's Cross itself due to the area's priciness, which in turn has changed the demographic landscape of the people and also the organizations that are drawn to the area. This serves as a careful reminder that regeneration projects do run the risk of gentrification, which impacts who can live, work, and play in certain parts of the city. In fact, Jonathan Simpson asserts that antisocial behavior orders, or ASBOs, got rid of certain types of antisocial people and activities in King's Cross by addressing the underlying issues associated with them, therefore making the regeneration successful. Yet this perspective remains contested, and other individuals claim that sex work was merely displaced, not solved. In fact, sex work and other sexual activities, like strip clubs and sex shops, have been cleaned up from King's Cross through a plethora of measures. The first three on this list, Operation Zero Tolerance, Operation Wellwyn, and Antisocial Behavior Orders, were largely aimed at removing street-based sexual conduct from the area. What I really want to focus on here, though, is how Camden Council have also controlled the existence of sexualized venues through the sex establishment policy. So that's non-street-based. It states that sexual entertainment venues, or SEVs, cannot be located within 250 meters of, quote, sensitive land uses, end quote, such as schools, churches, parks, hospitals, and museums. In addition, they have the power to license SEVs or not based on their judgment of an appropriate number in the area and the area's desired character. It concludes by saying, we have subsequently determined that the appropriate number of sex establishments to be located in Camden is nil. As such, it becomes clear that Camden is not only attempting to control sexual spaces in King's Cross through legal means, but also by using moralizing language. For example, what land uses could not potentially count as sensitive? Also, how is appropriate measured? All of this data together suggests that urban regeneration has sanitized sexual spaces in King's Cross to a significant extent. Overall, there was some overlap between stakeholder and resident perspectives, yet there was a difference in how certain ongoings were conceptualized. For example, the table below shows some slight differentiation in terms of how things like liminality or regeneration/gentrification were defined. These differences likely come down to different positions of power, positionality, and also priorities between both groups. Thank you very much for listening.